Hey folks, welcome aboard the channel. I'm Don. This is Thinking Theology, where I just talk about theological topics. I don't speak in favor of them. I don't speak against them. I just analyze mostly other people's arguments, pro or con, relating to theological things. Could be something specific like the origin of the Bible or a verse somewhere in the Bible, or it could be something scientific or some philosophical view that somebody has as to why God doesn't exist or why God does exist, whatever it is. I'll look at it. I'm not afraid of it. It doesn't faze me. I like hearing other people's ideas. All right, this one is Richard Dawkins on the most evil idea in the New Testament. Oh, Jesus. Dawkins was a smart guy, make no mistake. You may have hated what he had to say, but the dude was learned. I mean, it wasn't like he just came up with some willy-nilly idea somewhere and just said, I'm going to run with this. He has an extensive background in a lot of things. I have no clue what he was going to say about the most evil idea in the New Testament. Is it about God sending his only begotten son to die? What do you think? Is that where he's going to go with it? I don't know. All right, let's see what Mr. Dawkins has to say.
I think that to ground your morality certainly in the Bible would be an appalling thing to do. If you actually look at the Bible, actually look at almost any of the moral lessons you can take from it. And some of the things Jesus said are very nice, but you have to pick and choose your way through. And setting aside Jesus's emphasis on loving your neighbor, which is very nice. The Sermon on the Mount is very nice. The fundamental doctrine of the Old Testament, of course, is appalling. But even
putting the Old Testament aside, in the New Testament,
even the New Testament, the idea that we're born in sin is a hideous idea. The idea that the only way to be saved from sin and the wages of sin is Jesus' death. Is a hideous idea.
Many Jews have this issue as well, and Jewish friends or just Jewish apologists say this very same thing. That's partly the law. If I abide by a certain way, of course, I need God's forgiveness on things, but I can work it out myself, and my responsibility to make my life right. Somebody else couldn't atone for my own sins. Ezekiel even says that. I think it's in Ezekiel chapter 12 or 18 that every man or woman must atone for his or her own sins. Somebody else cannot pay the price for you. And then, so that would be a Jewish perspective as to why the New Testament doesn't work. Let's see where Richard goes with this.
And I don't think it's one that Jesus himself ever put forward, is it? I think he probably would be rather shocked at that thought.
Well, I imagine that Jesus would have to be aware of himself as the salvation. And if that's the case, he'll need to be aware of what he's saving people from, which can only be something like slavery to sin. Now,
I wonder whether you're reading something in there. I mean, salvation, he said things like, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father. He said that kind of thing. But did he actually say that he was salvation?
Well, I suppose I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah, but
no one comes unto the Father except through me. I am
a guide for a good life, something like that. It doesn't mean that he surely never said that my death is necessary in order for you to be saved from sin.
Quite possibly. I think about the idea of the Eucharist and the Last Supper and literally breaking up my body for you. It does seem to be some indication that Jesus knew what he was doing if the Christians are correct about his mission on earth. A moment ago you said
it could also just be a reference to the Romans, that he knew he would be ultimately getting in trouble with the Romans, because that's how it worked back then. If you were starting some kind of new movement that was against Rome, you'd be put to death. That was just the way it worked. But obviously there could be a lot more to it based on how you read the texts.
Appalling idea that we're all born in sin. And I understand this intuition, but do you not think there's some wisdom in this idea, or some sort of necessary humility in recognizing that we all do seem to fall short of the standards that we set for ourselves. That is, we're not going to make sense of a concept like sin because we don't believe in God. We're atheists. Sin doesn't make sense. But even just in terms of our own moral standards, whatever standards we set for ourselves, we seem to fall short of these every single day. And is it not just that idea that's being captured when somebody says, look, even by your own standards, you're falling short of where you should be? And maybe that's what...
Even a newborn baby
we should
born
take
in
it to mean.
sin?
Well, I would probably respond by saying that not all Christians will say that a newborn baby is born in sin in the sense that they're responsible for it. More like born with a propensity towards sinning, which I imagine you would even agree with, that newborn babies, although they haven't, committed immoral acts yet, they're born with this sort of human nature which has a predisposition towards doing things that fall short of our moral standards. Maybe.
Are they?
I'm sorry for you having to do a degree in this kind of thing.
No, but it's begging the question. It's a circular reasoning. Yeah, that goes beyond the scope of this, but it does have to do with what is learned. The flip side of it that I'll add here is, and I'd not thought of this before, but if we have a propensity to sin and that's our problem, the other side of the page would be we have propensity for goodness, and why isn't that rewarded much more highly? And maybe our focus is on the negative much more so than on the positive. And it tends to be that way in human beings, that we are more wired for pain avoidance than joy reception or such. And risk analysis shows this, that depending on how things are worded, that it's an irrational approach that we have toward risk, where we're more afraid of losing something than we are of gaining something. Even if the odds are extremely in our favor, the notion that we might lose something keeps us from taking what would be a mathematically reasonable risk. And I think that plays into this, where we focus on the negative and maybe not as much on the positive. And maybe that is why culturally and over time, we are sin conscious versus, say, goodness conscious. Or at least have a balance there between the two. I don't know. You guys can comment on that.
It's not a real subject, is it?
We talked about this before on our previous podcast, and I think it's something that you wanted to ask me about today, isn't it? I mean,
yes. It's obviously something that still interests you.
Certainly.
Talking about sin and things like that. I cannot imagine spending 3 years. How did you stand it?
I'll answer it in two ways. The first is to say that the theology faculty was actually theology and religion. So I was able to study religion as anthropology, religion as history. You can do papers in science and religion, this kind of stuff. And I imagine you'd be very interested in that kind of thing. Theology itself, I found useful for a few reasons. One of them, of course, there's like a crude sense in which by studying theology, it helps me to debate it. It helps me to argue with people.
But I get that, definitely.
But it's also an interesting window into human psychology. For example, clearly the question does interest you. Why is it that people can believe so strongly and so easily in this idea that everybody's born in sin?
Yes,
isn't that evil? Isn't that horrible?
That's a psychological question. And if you... I don't know what sort of essays you had to write, but if you were allowed to write an essay on that, that would have been interesting. If you were allowed to ask a question, how can anyone believe this stuff? But I imagine you had to actually write a serious essay on the concept of sin itself and the idea of redemption and the idea of atonement.
Well, suppose you wanted to write that essay, which you just said was an interesting question. Why would anybody believe this? Well, in order to answer that, you have to get to grips with the reasons people have for believing it.
Yes.
And I suppose that's what I'm doing here with you in saying, because you bring up the point when you look at the New Testament, you bring up this exegesis, this interpretation. This is an evil text because it tells people that they're born in sin. And I suppose the question implicitly in what you're saying there is, how can you believe this? And I'm doing that devil's advocate thing again of trying to, I suppose, explain why it is that somebody might believe this and say that even an atheist might recognize that there's a sense in which that's at least poetically true. We're all born in a state where we are unable to fulfill the standard that we want to fulfill. You know what I mean?
Poetically, yes, I suppose you could see it at a poetic level. Interestingly, I don't know whether I've told you this before, but when The Selfish Gene was published, both the chaplains of my college came up to me and said they'd read it and they thought it had echoes of Original Sin, and it was a poetic resonance with Original Sin, and I suppose that's quite interesting.
Why would The Selfish Gene have a resonance with Original Sin?
Well, they were thinking of it in terms of the selfish gene having
emanating
a sort of primitive rationale for selfishness. So that's not what the book was really intended to be about, but that's how they interpreted it, and so that resonated with their idea of Original Sin.
And what do you make of the criticism in the opposite direction? Somebody says, I've spent my life studying Thomistic metaphysics. I'm a classical theologian. I've got a PhD, and I looked in The God Delusion, and I wanted to see what Richard Dawkins had to say about Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs for the existence, his 5 ways to establish the existence of God. And they find 2 pages, and this sort of pinnacle of religious philosophy, as they see it, has a treatment in 2 pages.
Yes.
And when they question you and say, well, what about all of the important theological nuances, you respond to them, well, why would I do theology? Theology is uninteresting.
I think I would say to that, why privilege Christian theology when there are thousands of gods all around the world? They all have their own theology, and these Thomist theologians are equally ignorant of Aboriginal theology and Bantu theology and Papua New Guinea theology.
That's true.
And they think that their theology is somehow high flown and intellectually important, but it has no greater status than any of those. The thing about science is that it's universal. It is not local. It's not tied to any particular tribe or group of people or time in history. It's what you discover in science is universal and timeless.
I think that's fair enough.
Assuming the science is correct, in which case the error is timeless also. Same thing is true of mathematics. Mathematics is a subset of logic, and not the opposite way around. But mathematics itself is a philosophical construct because numbers themselves don't exist. It's just the way that we group things together, as you will. And Saul Kripke's naming and necessity and how we use language plays into how we conceptualize things. So science itself, I can't say I have a problem with the word. I'll take this off. I'll be done with this. Science itself, it has to abide by logical principles. And his point, it's well taken. Gravity, for example, applies to Christian, Buddhist, atheists, everybody worldwide. It's quote unquote universal, as we say. One of the underlying principles of physics is that laws apply universally, literally, universally throughout the universe. So that even ties into people looking at UFOs and how can they move so quickly in our atmosphere? If they exist, then whatever's inside that capsule is subject to local gravity here on Earth, unless there's some way they have inside of counteracting it, that you could just go from zero, just hovering, to hundreds of miles an hour, whatever they do. You have to account for the heat being generated in our atmosphere and such. And so, is there a way of understanding that? Maybe. There are physical principles that we clearly don't understand. The dimensionality, the theories of everything that philosophers and others are trying to come up with, and still try connecting everything in the universe. But Dawkins makes a good point that why do Christians themselves think, based on the gentleman's question here, think that they must be answered? Why do they get to set the table as far as what's a legitimate God or a legitimate view of God? It's a point well taken. As far as science goes, it's like, all right, well, when I study science, these principles apply to everybody. capillaries, aortas. You look at the biological sciences, what's going on inside us, bones, and what are they made of? Oh, calcium and other things. So okay, that applies to everybody. But on the other hand, it's not mutually exclusive. I mean, that can be a very limiting view as well. I mean, if there is a God, and I do believe, it makes sense to me that there's a God, not because any of the texts say it. It just makes sense to me on a very basic level that the way we understand origins, things come from somewhere. So where did all this matter in the universe come from? Maybe it always was. Maybe our notions of origins are prejudicial. It makes us think everything comes from somewhere. Maybe that's not true. But I can't conceptualize of something just poof coming ex nihilo. That's how I pronounce it. So it makes more sense to me that there was a being, a mind, a power, a something, an energy that created the matter that we see. Am I wrong on that? I don't know. But my sense tells me that that's the polarity of how things came into existence. The atheist would say matter was always here. Eventually mankind came out of the primordial soup. Eventually mankind's brain got big enough to where we could have active imaginations, and then we kind of veered off by saying, oh, that sun up there must be a god. Oh, that moon is different. God. Stars, God. And whatever else. And then people die of tooth infections, but they don't understand what an infection is. What happened there? Oh, the deity must be mad at me. Creative process. That is one way in which atheistic thought could proceed. So, chicken or the egg? Did matter come first and then God was spawned in our imagination? Or was there a God, a divine being, let's just call it that spoke everything into existence or somehow brought it into existence? That makes more sense to me. But in any case, you guys can decide what Dawkins said about original sin and whether or not you think we're born in it, what the pros and cons to it are. Does it help develop a conscience down the road that I do have these inclinations toward doing bad things? Yeah, I mean, it did. You could see there's a benefit to that. But what is there a net negative that comes out of that belief as well? Does it keep us living in fear? Does it keep us from becoming our better selves? I don't know. You could decide that. These psychosocial arguments are worth having. There it is, folks. I hope you enjoyed that. Leave your comments. I'll see you on another video and keep thinking theology.